I-V-M.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi and welcome to All Things Policy. On the 11th of January 2020, we saw the election of Tsai Ing-wen, the Democratic presidential candidate in the Taiwanese elections, and it's widely believed that she might very well inaugurate a new era of China-Taiwan PRC relations. So what we're going to do in this episode is kind of unpack the electoral politics of Taiwan for you, kind of examine them in relation to the politics of the mainland, which is the People's Republic of China, and try to understand the broader geopolitical implications of the election of Miss Tsai. So without any further ado, over to you guys. Welcome. Thank you guys for joining me, Manoj and Suyash. I want to first understand who were the people that were standing for election. What is Tsai Ing-wen's party? What kind of stance does she stand for? Why was she elected with, I believe this was a landslide, one of the most decisive electoral victories in recent Taiwanese history. So what's happening here?
So the election happened on this Saturday, that is 11th of January. The results were given same day evening. Results were anticipated on the same day evening. There were three parties. The first party, I'll talk about the first two major parties. The first party was DPP, who was led by Tsai Ing-wen. This party is believed to be a very anti-China party, anti-PRC party. At least their stands were such over the period. The second party was Kuomintang, and it was led by Han Kuo-yu. This party was believed to be, though it had taken a stand on one China, two systems, that they will not follow one China, two systems, but it believed, at least the rhetoric believed in greater economic and other integration and being close to PRC.
Okay, so just pause for a second to kind of help our listeners understand what is the one China two systems policy. Is it something that's only seen in Taiwan, or is it something that applies to other Chinese territories as well?
If I'm not wrong, it came out in 1992 consensus. One China two systems part is one. Essentially, you will identify one China, but there are two autonomous two systems. As in, there you will have autonomy over your region. For example, it is followed in Hong Kong, it is followed in Macau. So this came out of 1992 consensus.
So the 1992 consensus essentially talks between Taiwanese officials and mainland officials. And okay, let's just roll this back really way back. In 1949, when Mao Zedong announces the formation of the People's Republic of China, the guys who are his opponents, political rivals, are called the Kuomintang.
The very same guys who are in Taiwan today.
Yes, and those guys are led by Chiang Kai-shek. And what happens in that entire period, so this is from a period of the Chinese Civil War, which sort of begins from 1927, which is when, China is sort of ruled by a bunch of different warlords. You've got a so-called nationalist government, which is the Kuomintang's government led by Chiang Kai-shek. And then you've got the Communist Party of China, which is sort of contesting for political and physical space in the country. You reach a point where you sort of get an agreement between these two guys in the early 1920s. And then by 1927, that agreement sort of falls apart because the nationalists attack the communists.
So hang on. So this alliance that they had was basically prompted by an invasion?
So this alliance was essentially prompted by the fact that there was a threat of Japanese and so sort of invasions and these sorts of things happening in China. And therefore the idea was that can we work together and can we form a united front? And this is also again at a point of time when World War I has just ended. Worldwide there are economic tensions and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of frustration in China with regard to the Treaty of Versailles going back to World War I, where there was a sense that, well, now that this war is over, and this idea of self-determination is important because Woodrow Wilson is pitching for it. But in the Treaty of Versailles, territories held by the Chinese, or Chinese territory held by the Japanese, by the Germans, was given away to the Japanese. And that creates this sense of frustration that, well, the world is not really for self-determination. And that gives rise to student movements and so on and so forth. And the Communist Party is born. The Communist Party then works with the nationalists, given this context of Japanese presence and foreign presence in China. That united front, so-called, breaks by 1927, once the nationalists essentially take out a lot of the communist soldiers. And then there is a civil war that brews for a very long period of time, which sees periods of them working together and periods of them competing. A very brutal sort of competition, lots of mass killings. They also patch up things at some points of time when World War II sort of starts to kick off. And people, sort of our listeners should recall that World War II doesn't begin in Europe from a Chinese point of view. It actually begins when the Japanese invade China in the 1930s. So for them, that's important. Once World War II comes to an end, there's an opportunity where the nationalists and the communists are talking. They obviously can't come up with a modus vivendi because the communists essentially are looking at their own state. And the nationalists said, no, China is this. And there's a civil war again from 45 to 49, at the end of which essentially the nationalist government, which was in control of large parts of territory, starts to cede ground. And Chiang Kai-shek eventually flees to Taiwan, which had been in control with the Japanese for a very long period of time before World War II. So he goes there, he forms essentially his government over there. And that's where you have the People's Republic of China, which is the mainland as today it is. And you have the Republic of China or Taiwan. And the People's Republic essentially says, look, there is one China and you need to acknowledge the fact that there is one China. There can be many systems. They worked out a system for Hong Kong, which is one country, two systems. But in 1992, the PRC and Taiwan have a conversation in Hong Kong. And that conversation ends up with them coming up with this loose idea of a 1992 consensus, what's come to be known as the 1992 consensus. If you ask folks in the PRC, they'll tell you the consensus essentially means that we can have relations, we can talk about what the scope of our ties would be and how the sort of political arrangement would be, provided both sides acknowledge that there is only one China, given the fact that there is a Republic of China and a People's Republic of China.
So the Republic of China, again, just to clarify things, is Taiwan. So they've formally continued to call themselves that all this time.
Yes. So, but what that means and whether there is an acceptance of that is what's contested in some ways in Taiwan. So Tsai Ing-wen's party, the Democratic Progressive Party, along with Tsai Ing-wen, both of them essentially reject that there is any consensus. They reject this idea completely.
So if I can just ask, how exactly did China and Taiwan come to this agreement or whatever it was, since consensus is apparently not the right term to use? How did this end up happening in 92?
So there was a set of talks where, Taiwan sort of going through a churn because Taiwan wasn't necessarily democratic from day one, right? Chiang Kai-shek was a military guy. He was known as Generalissimo. And he sort of saw himself as this overarching autocratic ruler. And that's how Taiwan was. Taiwan goes through a process of gradual democratization through the 80s. And by the 1990s, there are constituencies, right? China is also reforming. It's opening up after Deng Xiaoping's reform in the early 1990s after sort of the Tiananmen Square massacre. There's a period of time where China is sort of rehabilitating itself. And there's a conversation of, well, how can we have better relations with each other? Largely to do with economic considerations. Taiwan's beginning to grow in the 80s. It's beginning to sort of develop. And there is a sense of envy sitting in the mainland where you're sitting on this massive territory and you're underdeveloped, whereas this tiny little island which calls itself China is actually rapidly developing. And therefore, there's a sort of China, from the PRC point of view also, that the priority is economic development. The priority is learning from other East Asian states, including places like South Korea, as to how you develop. So you look at an opportunity to try and improve your relations and try and get to some sort of a modus vivendi. And that's this modus vivendi, the 1992 consensus. There's a lot of confusion about whether there is a consensus or what that consensus entails, because what does one country, two systems mean? And what sort of role, if you were to say, assume a Hong Kong system, what sort of a role would the central government play? And would Taiwanese identity sort of allow that sort of thing?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but in the case of Hong Kong, you had a formal agreement with the British, their former colonial overlords. You had clear timelines kind of specified. You had demarcations of where the PRC's authority ends and where the Hong Kong government's authority begins.
Yeah, and this was Hong Kong was obviously ceded territory to the British formally in the 1800s. And in Taiwan's case, that was not the case. So there was an agreement of 100 years of lease for Hong Kong, which ended in 1997. And the process of negotiation with Britain of what happens post the lease expiring led to this framework of one country, two systems. And that was because the Brits and the West had a vested interest in Hong Kong, and they wanted to
vested interest.
Yeah, so they wanted to keep a certain kind of arrangement alive because they had their interests over there. But that was not the case with Taiwan. So there was a case of setting up a new framework. Now, Tsai Ing-wen and her party essentially say that, look, there is no such agreement. We are a sovereign entity, And there is such an agreement would entail giving up sovereignty. So, for example, Hong Kong is not a sovereign entity. And therefore, we would not accept something like this. And that's the biggest sort of bone of contention. It's not like the KMT says that we are going to acknowledge and accept a one country, two systems formula. But they are for some degree of a modus vivendi with the Chinese. And that's largely to do with the fact that over a period of time, economics is an extremely important factor. And the mainland is Taiwan's biggest economic partner. Their bilateral trade is about $150-160 billion. It's one of the biggest investors. Taiwan invests a lot in the mainland itself. So economics is a big driving factor here. But there's also a case of, well, how do you see the future going, given the fact that the mainland has become stronger, it's got greater capacity, and although it has spoken about peaceful, quote-unquote, reunification, Xi Jinping has also said in January last year, that he doesn't rule out the use of force. And as the PRC's capacity increases, there's all possibility of a use of force, although that will come with certain costs. So that's broadly what the 1992 consensus issue was currently in this particular election leading up to this election.
So even China's defense white paper. So after we had a conversation today in the office regarding the use of specific word in the report that you have written, I went back to China's defense white paper, and it is also having a very strong language on Taiwan.
Yeah.
Though they say it's a peaceful reunification, but they give a disclaimer that in spite of anything, we will not think before using force, etc., etc. Yeah. So they are very strong. And even if you go back and refer to, so before the white paper came out, there was Indo-Pacific strategy by United States. They have also mentioned that Taiwan is a strategic partner, future partner.
Yeah.
And a lot of the defense, there is a defense collaboration. And if you see the history over past few years, though Tsai Ing-wen really got popular after 2018, before that it was felt that she would lose her seat. But after she coming to power for the first time, there are a lot of defense agreements that have taken place between her and
and the US.
US, yeah.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So, Manoj, you actually have a report out, a strategic assessment of the Taiwanese election. So I kind of want to situate this kind of military posturing by China within a context of all the other things it's also doing in Taiwan. So my understanding of it so far is that there's a kind of gulf that happens in 1949. You have a faction within Taiwan that sees the benefits of integration with the mainland. The mainland has certain political motivations for wanting Taiwan to be part of under their control. And of course, you have people in Taiwan who don't necessarily agree that they need to be part of the mainland. While they agree that cooperation is important, they don't think that Taiwan should cede its sovereignty to the People's Republic. All fine. Now, you identified 6 instruments in your report, Manoj. So you talked about economic coercion, shows of military force, soft power and information campaigns, cyber warfare, diplomatic isolation, and corruption and espionage.
Yeah.
I, of course, find the 6th one most interesting. So let's begin with that. Can you tell us a bit about it?
So there's a lot of, this is something that's been discussed in different parts of the world, in the US also, where, you've sort of seen, or in Australia, where you've seen sort of this Chinese sharp power where, you create constituencies of political support by providing political donations, by essentially supporting certain leaders of certain parties and certain groups who are more favorable to you. And in Taiwan's case also, there have been cases of this. In fact, just a few months ago, there were 2 candidates who were eventually charged for corruption because they had accepted money from PRC entities for their election campaigns, and they hadn't disclosed it. And when they were eventually charged, they said, well, we didn't know we were supposed to disclose it.
A very Trumpian response, I have to
Exactly.
say.
So there's a lot of this. There's a lot of so again, Australia. I go back to Australia. There's a case going on currently in Australia of a alleged spy who's managed to get to Australia and is sort of leaking all this information about PRC's operations in different parts of the world, including Taiwan, and the links between the PRC and different agencies in Taiwan and different political groups in Taiwan. Again, this is all in the realm of speculation because it's still to be established whether the gentleman is a spy. But it's a case that sort of captured public imagination. In fact, even in the days leading up to the election, there were lots of, just last week, there were lots of reports about revelations that he'd made. So there's a lot of that. And again, it's very difficult to factually state that this is all that's happening. But if there is so much smoke, there has to be fire. And I think that's the case. At least in the case of the two guys who were charged formally and who were fined, there is very clear evidence which points to this. And that's led to also legislative change in Taiwan. So they've brought in just last month, in fact in December, the Taiwanese legislature passed a new law which essentially looked at foreign interference in political campaigning, political donations, advertising, and so on and so forth. And they tried to sort of curb some of these things because they saw that there were serious loopholes. I think it's called the anti-infiltration law, if I'm correct, but I can't remember the exact name. But that was passed just last month. Which just tells you about how much concern there is increasingly. The big thing about, I'll get to the other instruments later, but one of the big things about this election is that Tsai Ing-wen won at a point of time, like Suyash was saying, where she was unpopular. So over the last couple of years, the economy has taken a hit. So that's one thing. Economic growth, I think last year GDP growth was about 2.8%. And this year, in fact, it's supposed to decline further.
Has China, the PRC, played any role in doing this?
So there is some role for the PRC to play in this, of course. Generally the world economy is not doing great. But there is some role for the PRC to play in this because Chinese investment into the mainland has been growing at a decreasing rate. So it's not like it's fallen, but it's growing at a slower rate.
Double differential.
Yeah.
I can see you went to calculus class, Manoj.
No, I didn't. There's also a case where, certain agricultural imports from certain parts of Taiwan, which are DPP strongholds, have sort of reduced for the PRC, which is not surprising given that it's a modus operandi we've seen even in the trade war with the US.
Yeah.
There's also a case about tourism restrictions. So last year, the PRC essentially banned individual tourists from going to Taiwan. Individual tourism entails about 40% of overall PRC tourism in Taiwan. So, and estimates told us that there would be about a 0.6% hit on the GDP. And there has been a hit on the GDP, but Taiwan sort of managed to attract tourists from other parts of the world, South Korea, Japan, these places, to sort of offset some of that. So there have been economic instruments that have been used. And again, what to me was fascinating was that going into the election, people knew that future estimates tell you that the economy is going to slow down further. Yet people voted for Tsai Ing-wen. And not just her as president with an overwhelming majority of 57% of the vote, but also her party retains a majority in the assembly, which is called the legislative Yuan. Their majority is reduced from 68 seats in 2016 to 61 seats. Yet they control a majority because the total number is 113, total number of seats. So she can pursue a broader legislative agenda going forward also.
What do you think is on her agenda for this term?
So, there's lots of stuff. There's lots of economic stuff also. Just to give you a sense of even one of the other reasons why she was unpopular was because Taiwan passed legislation regarding gay rights in the last year, which was massively welcomed. But those things were put to referendum over a period of time and they failed in referendums.
Yeah.
So you can say that society was not necessarily for it, yet they pushed it through parliament, if you can call it parliament. They pushed it through the legislature. And that tells you a little bit about a social agenda, a little bit about the political agenda of ensuring Taiwan's sovereignty and building on that, building Taiwan's defenses. Her defense budget has gone up over the years and she's bought, like Suyash said, more weapons from the US.
Also, before we go to her agenda, Manoj, you said that 2.8%, 2.5 to 2.8% is her economic growth under her regime, right? But if you compare that with other countries in Southeast Asia or other important fast growing countries, she has maintained a broad 2.2, 2.8 range, which is unlike other countries which are in negative.
Yeah.
And that is what has sustained her, along with other nationalistic reforms.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also, to me, the interesting bit about the economy is this, right? That it was projected going forward that the economy is going to slow down significantly, down from 2.8 to 2%. If a government going into an election with public projections telling you that your economy is going to slow down further, and people still sort of reposing faith in that government is something which tells you a little bit about the popularity of the government. One of the reasons for that was, if you saw public polling going into the election, over half, nearly 60% of the people said that this is an election not about the economy, this is an election about national security, sovereignty and these things.
So that's exactly what I want to get to, because one thing that really changes the course of last year, of course, is the fact that these protests erupted in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And even what you guys have explained to us about the kind of difference between Hong Kong's one country, two systems sort of formal agreement and the de facto one country, two systems arrangement that prevailed in Taiwan so far, how exactly did the Taiwanese people react to what China was doing in Hong Kong?
I'd like to add 2 points to this. I'd like to first, before coming to Hong Kong, there were two, according to me, there were 2 points that has resulted in her coming back. One is the defense work, her work on defense, and second is Hong Kong. I'll come to Hong Kong in just a bit. Before that, on defense, if you see 2014 to 2018-19, after she's reformed, the number of training, number of exercises have increased in Taiwan Strait. For example, their bombers are carrying more exercises around the strait. Their frigates and destroyers are passing through the strait more. Recently, their aircraft carrier passed through the strait. So, in response to this, she has upped her game. She has recently, there was last year, 2019 was dominated by F-35 deal. Taiwan got F-35s, X number of F-35s from US. So these are some things done by her which is gaining popularity.
F-35 is one of the most advanced models of fighters.
One of the most multi-role aircrafts. Now coming to Hong Kong, it is a popular belief that till 2018, mid-2018, end 2018, she was not so popular as Manoj has rightly mentioned. But in 2019, after the escalation of Taiwan crisis, more votes have swung towards, after the escalation of Hong Kong crisis, more votes have swung towards her. So this popularity is, think of it in this way. China not able to control Hong Kong crisis, not able to manage Hong Kong crisis, has given more legitimacy to to Taiwan claim.
So the widely broadcast visuals of like police brutality and all that, and of like young people out on the streets, seem to have had a kind of political knockdown effect in Taiwan as well.
And that is where her vote percentage started going up slowly.
So Taiwan's demographics, as far as I can tell, obviously there seems to be quite a faction of young and progressive people. I'm assuming the people who are supporting the legalization of gay marriage, for example. And there seems to also be a larger contingent of middle-aged or slightly older people who are more concerned about issues like the economy, national security, all of which were things that Tsai wasn't doing that well on until recently.
That's largely true. Yes. There are 2 data points that I can point out to tell you that how this changed in the last 1 year. So there is, and it's not even 1 year that I've got data for. It's till June last year, which is when the protests in Hong Kong essentially got extremely violent, was June 12th.
Okay, so all this is in Manoj's report, so you guys should absolutely check it out. There'll be a link in the description, of course.
So what happened here is that essentially after the June 12th, so June 12th was a sort of landmark day in Hong Kong where essentially the extradition bill on which Hong Kong was sort of the protesters were arguing against is supposed to get debated in the legislature over there, and things get violent. Police fires rubber bullets, tear gas, and uses batons and declares it as a riot, and that is an escalation point in that protest. Now, data from sort of there's an election survey that was done by Taiwanese Institute, and data from that tells you that in June 2019 there was a spike from last year to June 2019 in the number of people in Taiwan who saw themselves essentially as Taiwanese. That is their primary identity. So it went from 54.5% to about 57%. And what declined was people who saw themselves as Taiwanese and Chinese, and people who saw themselves only as Chinese. So there was a sense of resurgence of national identity. So that's one thing. The second thing is there was a significant spike in the number of people who felt that Taiwan should move towards greater independence. So the spike in the number of people who felt that independence should be an immediate goal was small, but it was there, marginal, about 5.8% people. But the number of people who felt that at the moment perhaps we should maintain status quo while moving towards independence, that jumped from about 24 to about 27%. The rest of it sort of falls down. People who want to sort of maintain status quo and move towards reunification, people who want to move towards reunification immediately, and those sorts of things. So the data was telling us that people increasingly are concerned about this, and they actually want to move towards greater self-control and self-sovereignty. What also sort of added, apart from the shows of force that Suyash has talked about, was the sense that increasingly Beijing was peeling away Taiwan's allies. So under the One China principle, if you want to have diplomatic relationships with the people of China, The People's Republic of China, the People's Republic of China says that then you must recognize that there is a one China and that is us, and you must not have formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. In the 4 years of Tsai Ing-wen's rule, I think about 7 countries were taken away. 7 diplomatic allies were peeled away by Beijing, who shifted their allegiances from Taiwan to Beijing, and a lot of that had to do with economic inducements. A lot of Taiwan today has about 15 countries which recognize it.
And these are all tend to be rather minor countries.
These are all small island states, largely in the Pacific, some in the Caribbean, and no major power recognizes Taiwan as an independent state, let's put it that way. Yet all have some sort of a loose sort of informal diplomatic tie-up with the country. For example, the US. The US, like Suyash also mentioned, in the last year of Trump's administration, they've signed a deal worth $2.2 billion for tanks and missiles. They've also signed They've also announced an $8 billion deal for F-16s, that is F-16Vs.
Oh, they are not F-35s.
No, they're F-16Vs. Okay. And so essentially, Tsai is spending more and the US is selling more arms to them. So that tells you a little bit about the sense of anxiety. What also tells you a lot, and because politicians are smart people, wherever they are, they sense the public mood. And I think if one was to go back, and I think we'll try and see this, we'll try and put this ad in the show notes. On the eve of the election, the DPP came up with an advertisement which was essentially juxtaposing scenes of violence and chaos in Hong Kong with police brutality versus commuters going back home in Taiwan and talking about the need to preserve sovereignty. It was a powerful ad. It was a really powerful political ad, and it just tells you what they also saw as their core agenda, their core narrative, and their selling point. And it clearly sort of struck a chord with people.
To me, it's so remarkable how this idea of sovereignty, and especially economic sovereignty, when tied to the concept of some kind of historical national identity, can be so politically powerful. I mean, we've seen Brexit, I think, is going to be the archetypal example that comes up in history books decades from now, of how, despite all predictions of absolute economic disaster, you still saw people coming out and voting in support of a certain concept of British national identity, which I don't really agree with, of course.
In so many ways, I mean, that is why in so many ways this is a lack of strategic understanding from the PRC.
Yeah.
This idea that as our weight has grown, we can throw it around further and coerce people. Today, in a place like Taiwan, you've got 75% of the eligible voters voting. About 19.3 million people were eligible to vote. 75% of that voted, of which Tsai secured 57% of the vote. That's a massive chunk of population. Whatever instruments of coercion you use, whether it's economic, whether it's shows of force, whether it's espionage, whether it's information and misinformation campaigns, or any of the lot, it's going to be extremely difficult, because what you ended up doing is that you ended up actually, scoring self-goals. You ended up creating the sense of a monster that's around, which is going to engulf your identity, and it's taking you further away from your goal of possibly, if not, like they say, reunification, but at least some sort of a loose agreement where you can claim one China. It's taken you further away from that goal. And I don't see the PRC also shifting its position. I don't think it's going to be nimble. I mean, the big achievement for Xi Jinping was in 2015, before Tsai got elected. He had a meeting with the then president, who was from the KMT, Ma Ying-jeou. That was the first time ever that leaderships across the strait had met for a formal meeting. It was a meeting held in Singapore. And Ma Ying-jeou, at that point in time, sort of backed the 1992 consensus. 6 months later, the KMT lost the election and Tsai Ing-wen came to power. So if you had managed to sort of co-opt them into some sort of a dialogue mechanism while not necessarily agreeing, what happened as soon as she came to power in 2016 was that there was a formally established institutional mechanism for cross-strait dialogue. And the PRC suspended it. They walked away. They said, no, we're not going to have this conversation because you don't recognize the 1992 consensus. And I can see that politically, from a certain point of view, taking a hard position. But that's the thing. When you sort of saber-rattle too much, you end up in a position where it takes you further away from your goal.
And it also seems to me like in the process of pleasing the domestic audience, their core constituency so much, sometimes authoritarian regimes lose sight of how other constituents might be perceiving them.
Yeah.
With my limited understanding, I disagree with what Manoj is saying. If you turn the table around, you are basically trying to say that hardening of PRC's position has worsened the situation.
For them. Yeah.
But if hypothetically, if PRC had taken a soft position, how would it be different there? See, their stated goal is peaceful reunification. Would that have been met if PRC had taken a soft position? I don't think so.
I think the objective is how would you define reunification? Okay, so if you're anyway looking at some sort of two systems approach, if you're anyway looking at something like that, the only way that you're going to get there is by not radicalizing society, creating a sense of national identity and deepening that sense, but by actually finding a way to work together and get it, make it a fait accompli that you need to work together. And unless you're able to do that, if you're not even talking, the stick can only work for so long. Once society sort of hits back, which is what's happened today, you're in a position where even if the leadership wants to move, so tomorrow if you get a favorable leadership and even the leadership wants to move, there will be massive social resistance. So it's going to be very difficult unless you go in with force and you then sort of occupy. Unless you do that, politically, at least for the foreseeable future, Tsai now has a 4-year term, at least for the foreseeable future, it's not likely that you're going to be entering into any sort of an agreement. And I think it's also important if you go back to history, and I was reading Salman Was's book, China's Grand Strategy. And in the first chapter of the book, he talks about this battle during Mao's time, where Mao does not really have a state and the Communist Party is fighting with the nationalists. And he talks about the fact that in many ways, Mao would have probably at that point of time accepted not one but two Chinas, coming to some sort of an agreement, because for him sovereignty was important and he would have not given up his sovereignty. Look at it today from the point of view of Taiwan. If you give them some sort of sovereign assurances, they will probably be okay with it. And there might be an agreement. I'm not saying they will be okay with it. I'm saying there might be, the possibility of an agreement is greater in that condition. But if you demand reunification in the way that the PRC thinks of it, or in the way that Xi Jinping has defined it, it seems highly unlikely that you're going to succeed. And evidence at the moment tells you that your policy for the last 4 years has failed. And some sort of an engagement would have worked better, rather than disengaging, peeling away allies, trying to economically coerce, banning tourists, doing all sorts of other things. Even your espionage and misinformation campaigns and so on and so forth, at whatever scale they've been conducted, haven't not necessarily yielded the results. About 1.5 years ago, they could have probably been chuffed about it, because when Han Kuo-yu was elected as mayor of Kaohsiung, I think at that point in time, there was a sense that, this is working. But as with Hong Kong, you can see that the protests have galvanized people. And I think it's very difficult to walk back from this.
But again, the same point, I agree with what you say partially, that hardening of the stance has not helped them. But again, we are arguing on the premise that softening of the stamp would have helped them, and would have come to a
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that current policy has failed. And it would have been better if you had engaged, given the evidence today that we can see that current policy has failed. At the end of the day, you cannot alienate a large section of society while trying to integrate. It will lead to chaos. It has led to chaos in Hong Kong. It will lead to chaos in Taiwan. And none of that chaos is ever going to serve your interest. And that's what's been evidenced. So at this point of time also, I don't see the PRC sort of softening its position and learning from its mistakes. In fact, soon after, whatever statements have come out, they've essentially said that, the basic nature of ties is not going to change, which basically tells you there's going to be more of this. If you look at it from an objective point of view, if you have to achieve this, and if this is your broader part of national rejuvenation, which if your deadline is 2049 or 2050, today you are further away from that objective. And this approach hasn't worked.
If it is peaceful reunification.
If it is reunification. If it is reunification, if that is your objective also, whether it's peaceful or not. See, if you occupy force, then all of this is obviously, if you take force and occupy the territory, then all of this is gone. Then it's another problem altogether. But until you're using other instruments, except force, what evidence at the moment tells you is that over half of Taiwanese who voted, which is a large chunk of people who voted, saw this as a threat. And I think that's a problem for the PRC.
No, those numbers can't lie. I mean, if China can't see the writing on the wall and have decided to continue with this policy, nevertheless, I think it speaks to the fact that the system is not necessarily as flexible as we might like to believe. And they've kind of backed themselves into a certain mode of operation which might not really help them achieve their objectives. But hey, that was a great insight. Thank you so much, Manoj. Thank you, Suyash. I have one final question before we wrap up this podcast, which is, do you see this affecting India in any way? Do you see any chance for India to kind of, clearly China does not really have a policy of recognizing India's territorial claims. Do you think India should continue to be as polite with our recognition of the One China policy?
I think yesterday something happened on Twitter, right? You had posted a tweet.
Yeah, my thought is that I don't see the reason why the MEA cannot issue a statement congratulating Taiwan on its elections and, hailing democracy. Do it as non-controversially as possible, but if India's value proposition globally is that we are the world's largest democracy and we believe in the democratic process, I don't see why we should not. You might not want to call her president, fair enough, because you don't recognize her as president, yet you have an informal Taiwanese mission in India. Taiwan is an important partner in terms of its investments in India have increased over the last couple of years. If my numbers are correct, I think some 700 million worth of investment has come in, $700 million from Taiwan.
Also, there is a student exchange.
There's a student exchange. There is also the possibility of, when I say $700 million, let's caveat that with the fact that over the last 4 or 5 years from China, from the PRC, $8 to $9 billion worth of investment has come in and more can come in. So I'm not saying we should be switching diplomatic allegiances, but at least we should be, if there is a value system that we think is worth standing up for, we should be standing up for it. It's also important for us to signal to our partners in Beijing that there are things that even we keep an eye on. Again, as non-controversially as possible, celebrating the fact that there is a peaceful transition and those sorts of things, and congratulating Taiwan on holding elections in times when holding elections can be extremely complicated. I really don't see why we shouldn't do that just out of the principle of it also.
I agree. This is a part of larger scheme of things where you were saying that India should build capabilities. So one is hard, one is soft. The soft capability can be soft diplomatic capability.
And I think we also need to think of the fact that Taiwan can be a very important partner in terms of semiconductors and things like that. And I don't think we've done enough to explore that. There have been some steps in the last couple of years, but I don't think we've done enough. I think if we are looking to secure ourselves in an era where 5G, AI, the lack of semiconductors can create dependencies internationally, and those can be strategic issues for us. And we are talking about indigenization of some of these things without the capacity to manufacture them. Taiwan has the capacity to manufacture them. Let's design, let them manufacture. But for that, you also need to build up a certain political capital. And I'm sure just a simple statement congratulating the Taiwanese on holding an election is good enough.
And on that note, thank you guys so much for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, Storytel, and Cambly. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On the Pragati podcast this week, journalist Rohini Mohan joins Pawan to discuss Assam's unique history, how the NRC was rolled out in Assam, and what a nationwide NRC might look like. On IVM Likes, Antariksh, Abbas, Ritika talk about their pop culture resolutions for this new year. On Ganatantra, Saryu and Alok are joined by Dr. M.K. Raghavendra to explore how the politics in Indian cinema gets influenced by politics itself. On Tapri Tales, Madhuri talks about the state of our mental health in the midst of political and environmental crises that are surrounding us through her story, A Day of Anxiety. On States of Anarchy, Hamsuni looks at 7 major global affairs stories from 2019 and looks at the way forward in 2020. Thanks and keep listening.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we and indeed much of the world has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan. a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcast from.